Gavin Newsom marched into the Senate hearing room armed with a 60-page binder of excuses, completely unaware that JD Vance only needed a single sheet of paper to destroy his political facade. JD Vance never raised his voice, hurled a single insult, or lost his temper. Sitting directly across the heavy wooden table, he simply read a list of addresses from one solitary page. Each address belonged to a working family that had fled California. Newsom brought 60 dense pages of bureaucratic justifications explaining why those people should have remained, yet he couldn't successfully deploy a single one. Every address Vance read aloud echoed the exact same tragic reality. Newsom had shown up 15 minutes early, sitting by himself, meticulously color-coding his massive binder with a luxury fountain pen worth more than a working-class family's weekly groceries. When the cameras finally rolled, his tabs were perfectly aligned and his rehearsed talking points were locked in. But Newsom failed to realize one crucial detail. The man sitting opposite him hadn't arrived to ask standard political questions. He had come to read names. As the committee chairman brought the hearing to order, Newsom confidently leaned in, adjusted his microphone, and took a measured sip of water. He launched into his opening testimony, mirroring the exact cadence of his televised press conferences. His shoulders were perfectly squared, his chin held high, and his tone calibrated to that precise frequency, conveying effortless authority. He had spent 2 decades perfecting this polished version of himself, and it still fit him as flawlessly as a custom-tailored suit. The state of California proudly remains the 5th largest economy on the planet, he proclaimed. For the first time in years, our unhoused population is visibly declining. We are absolutely not a state in decline. We are a state in transition. In fact, the governor weaponized the word transition 3 distinct times before Vance even opened his mouth. Vance remained entirely motionless, his hands calmly resting over his single piece of paper. He had no thick binder, no frantic aides sliding him sticky notes, not even a glass of water to sip. He simply studied Newsom with the quiet intensity of a veteran mechanic listening to an engine that sounds decent to an amateur but is clearly pulling dangerously to the left. Finally, he leaned toward his microphone. Governor, the tone was incredibly hushed. It wasn't aggressive or theatrical in the slightest. It was simply the voice of a man who possessed a genuine question and demanded a real answer. You utilized the word transition 3 separate times during your opening remarks. I want to ensure I fully comprehend what you mean by that. Could you please clarify exactly what California is transitioning away from? Newsom's pristine, camera-ready smile remained firmly in place. We are transitioning away from an era of unprecedented national disruption, the global pandemic, the collapse of international supply chains, and historic inflationary pressures. California was not immune to these macroeconomic forces, Vice President Vance. No state in the union was. However, our administration's response has been to aggressively invest in affordable housing, critical infrastructure, and bold climate initiatives. I didn't ask you about your response, Vance interrupted smoothly. The temperature in the hearing room seemed to instantaneously drop. I didn't ask you about the pandemic, Vance continued, his tone unwavering. I didn't ask about global supply chains. I asked you about the 200,000 American citizens who packed their bags and abandoned your state just last year. Vance casually picked up his single sheet of paper by the corner. Where exactly are they transitioning to? For a fraction of a second, Newsom's trademark smile wavered. His hands immediately dropped to his binder. He straightened it out, then pulled his hands back. Vance began reading from his sheet. Nashville, Austin, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Boise, Dallas. He gently set the paper back down. Governor, these aren't just random dots on a map. These cities share very specific characteristics. Why do you suppose 200,000 of your residents all decided to flee to the exact same types of places? That is not an entirely fair characterization of Newsom, caught himself instantly resetting his posture. The stumble was microscopic, but in the dead silent gallery, everyone heard it. The underlying factors driving domestic migration in this country are incredibly complex. Frankly, many of them stem directly from federal policies, national housing shortages, the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes, and the explosive expansion of remote work. I didn't ask about Washington, D.C., Vance replied. He still hadn't raised his voice a single decibel. I asked about California, the state that you personally govern, the specific state those families desperately wanted to leave. In the back row of the gallery, a woman slowly uncrossed her arms. A legislative aide standing behind Newsom nervously checked her phone. The atmosphere in the room wasn't outright hostile yet, but it was shifting. It was leaning heavily, like a jury right before it delivers a devastating verdict. Vance leaned back in his chair. When he spoke next, his voice softened even further. For a brief moment, he didn't sound like the Vice President of the United States. He sounded like a concerned neighbor sitting at a kitchen table trying to make sense of something completely irrational. Governor, I'm genuinely not sitting here trying to embarrass you. I'm just trying to understand the logic. Where I grew up, if you owned the biggest, most beautiful house on the block and people were still actively fleeing your neighborhood, you didn't point fingers at the other neighbors. You took a hard look at the house. He folded his hands together. You have the most beautiful coastline in the country. You have flawless weather. You have the economic engine of Silicon Valley. And yet, everyday folks are running away from it as fast as they can. That isn't a partisan political argument, Governor. That is a fundamental riddle. Newsom opened his mouth, closed it again, and then forcefully flipped open his binder to a page he hadn't bookmarked. This was Newsom's signature move, renaming a crisis. It was the political equivalent of calling a past due eviction notice a flexible housing transition. The grim reality doesn't change, but it buys you a day of good PR. But JD, Vance hadn't come to debate terminology. He had come for the cold, hard math, and Newsom had brought 60 pages of it. Newsom shifted his weight forward, his entire physical presence changing. The carefully rehearsed Californian calm evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp combativeness. He gripped the binder with both hands and began aggressively turning the pages, resembling a high-priced defense attorney who senses the jury is slipping away. Let me be highly specific with you, Newsom shot back. Since the day I took the oath of office, the state of California has invested a staggering $37 billion directly into homelessness initiatives, Project Roomkey, Clean California. Unprecedented executive orders designed to streamline housing development in every major metropolitan area. We have funded mental health treatment, addiction, recovery services, and transitional housing at historic levels. He glared up from the text. These are not empty talking points, Mr. Vice President. These are concrete line items. We have the receipts for every single dollar. With every page he flipped, Newsom was raising a shield. With every massive dollar figure, he quoted, he was building a wall, and for about 30 seconds, the performance actually worked. The entire room watched a seasoned governor completely command his material. Even his harshest critics in the chamber had to silently acknowledge that the man came prepared. Vance simply sat there, patiently waiting until Newsom's hands finally stopped turning the pages. Then he nodded slowly. The exact kind of nod a prosecutor gives when the suspect has just voluntarily handed over the evidence. Governor, you just proudly listed off programs that cost the taxpayers $37 billion. Yet the rate of homelessness in California skyrocketed by 24% during the exact same period you were spending that money. When you started your term, you were gifted a historic $100 billion budget surplus. Today, you are staring down the barrel of a catastrophic $60 billion deficit. Vance let the sheer weight of those numbers hang in the heavy air. My grandmother raised me, Governor. She worked brutal double shifts at a nursing home in Middletown, Ohio. She never made a dime over $30,000 a year in her entire life. But she used to tell me, if you pay good, hard-earned money to fix a problem, and the problem only gets worse, the money isn't the problem. You are the problem. He leaned in closer to the mic, $37 billion. What exactly did you buy with it? Newsom's chin jutted upward in defiance. These massive systemic issues take time to resolve, Senator. Senator, Vance hadn't held the title of senator for over 2 years. These are deeply entrenched, generational crises that demand sustained, long-term financial commitment, Newsom pushed on. You simply cannot reverse a decades-in-the-making housing shortage in a single budget cycle. You cannot eradicate homelessness with one magic program. The trajectory, respectfully, Governor, I wasn't asking you about your trajectory. I was asking you for results. Vance's delivery remained terrifyingly calm and level, which only made the impact that much more devastating. You incinerated $37 billion. The homelessness crisis worsened dramatically. You blew through a historic surplus and plunged your state into a historic deficit. And your defense today is to look the American people in the eye and say, you just need more time. Vance leaned back. Governor, if I hired a general contractor to remodel my kitchen and he blew through $37 billion and the sink still didn't drain, I wouldn't give that contractor an extension. I would immediately change the locks on my front door. A low murmur rippled through the Senate gallery. It wasn't exactly laughter. It was the visceral sound of recognition. It was the collective exhale of a room full of people hearing a deeply held truth finally spoken out loud. Vance wasn't smiling. His voice downshifted into something much heavier and slower. He was no longer functioning as a politician debating a rival. He was a man exposing a raw nerve. Right now, Governor, I want to talk about a specific family living in Bakersfield. Both the mother and the father work full-time jobs. They leave their home before the sun comes up, and they don't return until long after it sets. Their monthly rent for a modest 2-bedroom apartment is currently $4,000. 5 years ago, that exact same apartment cost them $2,000. Every morning, their young children have to navigate past 3 separate homeless encampments just to walk to a public school that recently gutted its art and music programs due to your budget cuts. Those parents haven't been to a dentist in over 2 years. And it's not because they don't care about their health. It's because every single month they have to choose between getting a cavity filled or keeping the electricity turned on. The gallery was paralyzed. A camera operator smoothly adjusted his lens to frame Vance's face in a tight close-up and completely locked the shot. And yet, Governor, every single time that exhausted family turns on their television, they are forced to watch you. Standing behind a polished podium, wearing a suit that costs more than their monthly rent, confidently lecturing them that the state of California is a shining model for the rest of the nation. Vance let the silence ring out. That family does not need another bureaucratic program, Governor. They do not need another glossy executive order. They certainly don't need another heavily tabbed page in your binder. They desperately need a governor who actually acknowledges they exist. Newsom's 60-page binder remained open on the table, but his hands had frozen. His eyes darted around the room, instinctively searching for the supportive nods from his allies that had been so prevalent just 20 minutes earlier. They were entirely gone. There is a specific breed of politician that becomes incredibly dangerous the moment the statistical arguments fail them. That is the precise moment they abandon policy debates and resort to personal attacks. Newsom had exactly 1 bullet left in his chamber, and it wasn't written anywhere in his notes. As Vance reached to adjust his sheet of paper, Newsom struck. Governor, I want to clarify why this issue is so deeply personal for me, Vance started. I grew up in Ohio. I know exactly where you grew up, Mr. Vice President. I've read your memoir. Newsom's voice sliced across the chamber like a steel blade. Vance stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hovering half open. Newsom leaned aggressively into his microphone. He completely dropped the rapid-fire statistical jargon. His voice was slower now, highly controlled, and dripping with venom. You grew up in deep poverty. Your mother battled severe addiction issues. Your grandmother had to raise you. You served honorably in the Marine Corps. You attended Ohio State and eventually Yale Law School. By any objective metric, yours is a truly remarkable, quintessential American success story. Newsom paused, locking eyes with Vance. He wasn't waiting for applause. He was aiming for the jugular. But you didn't actually stay in Ohio to build your life, did you? After you got your Ivy League degree, you packed up and moved straight to San Francisco. You entrenched yourself in Silicon Valley. You amassed your personal fortune working in venture capital right there in the state of California. Newsom didn't blink. California handed you your elite network. California provided you with your wealthy investors. California gave you the incredibly lucrative career that ultimately allowed you to sit in that vice presidential chair today. You happily extracted every single ounce of wealth and opportunity my state had to offer. And now you have the audacity to sit across this table and lecture me that it is broken. A low gasp echoed through the gallery. Heads swiveled rapidly, and several sympathetic nods were suddenly directed toward the governor. The magnetic polarity of the room violently reversed, and for the first time since the gavel fell, the momentum swung entirely away from the dais and directly into Newsom's hands. For 30 thrilling seconds, Gavin Newsom was the absolute master of the room, and he pushed his advantage hard. People move. Vice President Vance, that is simply what free citizens do in a free society. You moved yourself. Millions of Americans relocate across state lines every single year. 1.7 million people is just a demographic number. It is not some catastrophic national tragedy. He had just reduced 1.7 million fleeing citizens to a mere statistic. Vance sat perfectly still. His hands rested flat on the desk, his palm gently covering his single piece of paper. For a fleeting moment, he looked like a man who had taken a clean, devastating hit and needed a second to find his footing. Then Vance finally spoke. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Governor." The voice was unshakable. It wasn't defeated, it was merely recalibrated. California absolutely gave me a chance. It provided me with a career trajectory and a life that I could never have achieved back in Middletown, Ohio. I know that deeply in my bones. I have never once tried to deny it. Vance leaned in, and that is exactly why I am sitting here today. Not because I harbor some deep hatred for California, but because I owe a profound debt to it. Because the golden California that handed me that incredible opportunity does not exist anymore. It doesn't exist for that struggling family in Bakersfield. It doesn't exist for a public school teacher in Fresno. And it certainly doesn't exist for a Los Angeles firefighter who can no longer afford to live within the city limits he protects with his life. He had taken Newsom's most vicious haymaker and seamlessly reversed its momentum to crush his opponent. The gallery collectively inhaled. The shift in the room's energy wasn't instantaneous. It was the slow turn of a weather vane after the wind dramatically changes direction. Let me take you back to one specific evening. Governor, Vance continued quietly. The 6th of November, 2020, you were seated at the exclusive French Laundry restaurant in the heart of Napa Valley at a cost of roughly $350 per plate, no masks. Surrounded by 12 guests, flowing wine, ambient candlelight, and high-powered lobbyists. Newsom's jaw visibly clenched. He pulled his hands away from the microphone and laid them flat on the table, intentionally distancing himself from his useless binder. On that exact same day, Vance said, his voice dropping, "You had just enforced a ban on indoor dining that impacted 94% of the citizens of California. Ordinary families were legally forbidden from sharing a meal in a restaurant. Generational small businesses were permanently boarding up their windows by the hundreds. Children were locked out of their own schools. And while all of that devastation was happening, you were sitting at a luxury dining table that cost more for a single evening than many of those struggling families spend on groceries in an entire month. Vance's voice did not rise. It dropped further. I don't hold that against you as a human being, Governor. People make terrible mistakes. People have bad nights. I completely understand that. But here is exactly what I do hold against you. You never actually grasped why your actions were so deeply offensive. You genuinely believed your only problem was that someone happened to snap a photograph. The actual tragedy, Governor, was that while you were leisurely debating which vintage wine to order, the people you were elected to govern were agonizing over whether to pay their mortgage or buy their medicine. Newsom's chest rose and fell in heavy, visible rhythms. It was the hyper-controlled breathing of a man desperately calculating his next move, deciding exactly what to say and what to leave unsaid. You are a talented man, Governor Vance said, the tone shifting to something softer, almost sad. You speak well, you present perfectly, you work hard. I genuinely believe that you think you are helping people. I do not believe you wake up every morning intentionally trying to fail. Vance let the caveat settle. But somewhere along the way, the chasm between your privileged reality and their daily nightmare grew so unbelievably wide that you completely lost the ability to see across it. And it isn't because you are inherently cruel. It is because you are deeply comfortable. And in a governor, the catastrophic results are exactly the same. Newsom slumped backward in his chair. The binder sat uselessly in front of him, untouched. His hands rested on either side of it as if the notebook belonged to a complete stranger. This confrontation was no longer just a clash of two politicians. It was an existential trial about whether the elite class who engineers our society should be forced to endure the consequences of the world they've built. Vance wasn't quite done, but he was close, and his hand rested firmly on his single sheet of paper. Newsom forced himself to sit upright. Whatever internal barrier Vance had shattered with the French Laundry anecdote, Newsom furiously tried to patch it back together using language. Vice President Vance, let me be entirely honest with you. This hearing has absolutely nothing to do with genuine governance. This is about politics. California is a target because we boldly lead on the issues that make the rest of the country uncomfortable. Climate, immigration, equity, we do the incredibly hard things. And predictably, every single election cycle, someone hailing from a state with half our GDP and a fraction of our complexity sits in that chair and tells us we are failing. He wasn't entirely wrong about the sheer complexity. Managing 40 million residents representing the fifth largest economy in the world is immense. Wildfires, earthquakes, droughts, a massive border, a sprawling coastline, and a tech industry that could fund a small country. Governing California is not a job for someone who folds under pressure. And whatever else Newsom was, he was not a man who folded. But Vance refused to take the bait. Governor Tesla, abandon your state. In-N-Out Burger left your state. Chevron left your state. 1.7 million people fled your state. Vance explicitly counted them off on his fingers, not for theater, but for arithmetic. Did they all leave because of your progressive values? Newsom shifted. Net migration is vastly more complex than a headline, Mr. Vice President. California continues to attract more international immigration than any state in the country. Our population. So your answer is that the people who grew up in California, who physically built California, and who paid taxes in California for 20 and 30 years left, and because you merely replaced them, you are calling that a success? The word replaced hit the chamber like a heavy bill landing on a doormat. Quiet, heavy, impossible to ignore. You said something earlier that I wrote down. Vance picked up his sheet and turned it over. On the back, in his own handwriting, was a single sentence. You confidently stated, "People move." That is what people do in a free country. Let me tell you about the people who moved. He turned the sheet back to the side with addresses. This address belongs to a teacher in Fresno. 22 years in the exact same school district, teaching third grade. She knew every family on her block by name. She moved to Boise last March because her rent went up $1,100 in 2 years and her salary went up 0. He moved his finger down the page. This one was a firefighter. Vance looked up from the paper. 14 years. Responded to the Woolsey fire and the Palisades fire. He set the paper down for a moment. He moved to Phoenix because he could no longer afford to live in the city he was risking his own life to protect. One more. This address was a small business owner in San Diego. Auto repair, 3 generations deep. His grandfather started the shop. His father ran it for 30 years. He closed it in September and moved his family to Dallas. Not because business was bad, but because between taxes, insurance, permits, and regulations, the math simply stopped working. The shop was profitable. The state was not. Each address landed in the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. No splash, just rings moving outward. Newsom's hand slowly reached toward his binder. It stopped halfway. His fingers hovered over the cover for a brief second before settling beside it. He did not open it. He cleared his throat. Those numbers do not paint the full picture. Numbers. He had just called the teacher, the firefighter, and the family who closed their grandfather's shop numbers. Vance set his sheet down face up. They didn't leave because of the weather, Governor. The weather is the exact reason people used to come. They didn't leave because of politics. Most of them didn't care about politics until politics started caring about their paychecks. They left because they literally could not afford to stay in the state you run. And you know that. You have always known that. Newsom looked directly at Vance. And for the first time in the hearing, he did not look like an untouchable governor preparing a rehearsed answer. He looked like a man who had completely run out of pages, Vice President Vance. His voice was radically different, stripped. The polish was entirely gone. I have made mistakes. I have admitted to those mistakes publicly, but I have stood in rooms you have never been in, making agonizing decisions that no one in this chamber has ever had to make. Governing 40 million people is not a tidy hearing. It is not a sheet of paper. It is the absolute hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done it every single day for 7 years. For a moment, nobody in the room breathed. He was not wrong. Governing is brutally hard. The exhaustive hours are real. The crushing pressure is real. The crisis rooms he described are real. And for exactly 3 seconds, the gallery sat with that truth, a brief flicker of something close to empathy, a recognition that the man sitting at the witness table was still a human being. Vance nodded once, not dismissive, not sarcastic. The solemn nod of a man who heard what was said and respected it enough not to pretend otherwise. Then he looked back down at the single sheet of paper. The addresses were still there, every last one of them. Do you want to know the story every one of those addresses has in common? The room went completely still. He is the man who polished the doorknob while the house burned down. The gallery did not move. Nobody in that room moved. Not because they were surprised, but because they had been waiting a very long time for that exact feeling to be articulated. California used to be where the roads ended because nobody wanted to go any further. Route 66 did not stop at the Pacific because the highway ran out of asphalt. It stopped because the people driving it ran out of reasons to keep going. They had found it, the last best place, the end of the American road, and the beginning of whatever came next. For 100 years, California was the triumphant answer to the question every other state was still asking. And in the span of one governorship, the traffic utterly reversed. The exact same highways that carried hopeful grandparents west are now carrying their grandchildren east, not towards something, but away from something, away from $4,000 rent and $12 gas and sidewalks that smell like something no one in City Hall will publicly name, away from schools that cut art programs to fund consultants, away from a state that spends $37 billion on homelessness and somehow has more unhoused people than when it started. The people watching this do not need anyone to explain what went wrong. They already know. They have known longer than any senator, vice president, or cable news anchor. They knew it when the grocery bill skyrocketed and the paycheck did not. They knew it when the gas station hit $80 and the governor was talking about luxury electric vehicles. They knew it when the squatter's tent appeared outside the pharmacy and no one removed it for 6 months. Gavin Newsom is not a bad man. That is not the point. The point is that he is a certain kind of man. The kind who is so profoundly good at the performance of governing that he stopped noticing when the governing itself fundamentally broke. The kind who can stand behind a podium, deliver a perfect 30-second answer about housing, and then slide into a car that drives past 40 tents on the way to a luxury dinner. Not because he doesn't see them, but because he has a program for them. He always has a program, he just never has a result. And that is not exclusively a Gavin Newsom problem. That is a problem with a specific kind of leadership that has been festering in this country for 30 years. Leadership that solely measures itself by inputs, billions spent, orders signed, programs launched, press conferences held, and never by actual outputs. Did the rent go down? Was the tent moved? Did the family stay? Those harsh questions don't get press conferences. They demand answers, and the answers for 7 years have all been identical. If you are one of the people who left, you do not need anyone to tell your story. You lived it. You packed the cardboard boxes. You sold the house for less than you paid. You painfully explained to your kids why they were changing schools. You do not need a vice president to validate what you already know to be true. And if you are still there, still holding on, still paying the extortionate taxes and stepping over the needles and sitting in traffic while watching the governor smile on television and promise that things are getting better, you already know everything, Jay. JD Vance said in that hearing room, "You have known it far longer than he has. You have been saying it to your kitchen table for years." Somewhere in the quiet suburbs of Boise tonight, a dedicated teacher who poured 22 years into the children of Fresno is unpacking her last moving box. She gently pulls out a photograph of her old classroom and tapes it to her new refrigerator door. The children in the photo are smiling brightly. The bulletin board behind them spells out, "Welcome back." In yellow letters she cut out by hand. California is still vividly alive in that photo. It is just not on her driver's license anymore.